Dr. Anthony Clark, a professor of Chinese history, and this series is about the Catholic martyr saints of China, a place that is often called the Middle Kingdom. It is true that when most people think of the Dominican order, they imagine St. Dominic and St. Catherine of Siena, the Rosary, the great Roman church Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and yes, they might even recall the complicated Dominican history in the Spanish Inquisition. But many Dominicans left the tumult of Christian Europe for distant shores, where they fulfilled the central purpose of their order, to preach. The desire to bring souls to God inspired several courageous sons of St. Dominic to endure the hardships of sea travel, and he died on the way, to preach the gospel of salvation to the people of the Middle Kingdom. The Dominicans gave China its first native bishop, Luo Wenzhao, who is said to have baptized more than 2,000 of his fellow Chinese. And the order of preachers has already given the Church 6 holy martyr saints who died in China as witnesses to the truths they taught. In fact, the Holy See recognizes the humble Dominican priest, St. Francis Capillas, as one of China's proto-martyrs. St. Capillas was beheaded as he prayed the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary on January 15th, 1648. The seed of his blood, planted over 3 centuries ago, continues to grow in southern China, where he died for refusing to deny God. The Dominicans first entered China during the brutal end of the Ming Dynasty. It was a perilous time for everyone in China, especially missionaries. When the Manchurian armies were defeating the last Ming emperor and establishing the Qing Dynasty in 1644, Spanish Dominicans of the province of the Holy Rosary had already established a very active Catholic mission in Fujian province. One of the early actions of China's new Manchurian government was to issue an edict of persecution against Christians on August 9th, 1647. St. Capillas was killed in the wake of this edict. While the Qing emperor had befriended the missionaries who lived in the capital, Beijing, Catholic missions elsewhere suffered terrible harassment. Under the new court, Christians faced harsh challenges, and the Dominican churches in China suffered particular discriminations. In all, there are 6 canonized Dominican martyr saints of China: St. Francis Capillas, Peter Sanz, Joachim Royo, John Alcober, Francis Serrano, and Francis Diaz. Many anti-Christian decrees followed the original edict of 1647, though at times the missionaries received mixed signals from the imperial court. Emperor Kangxi, for example, issued his famous Decree of Tolerance in 1720. He wrote, "As the religion you preach is without harm or benefit to China, so also it is of no consequence whether you go or stay." Well, it wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it did allow Christians to live in peace in the Middle Kingdom for a while. Emperors come and go, and China's next ruler was not so tolerant of Catholic missions. Only 4 years after Kangxi's decree was published, a new emperor occupied the dragon throne, Yongzheng, and this ruler reversed his father's more open-minded commands. In 1724, Yongzheng published a new decree essentially forbidding Christianity in China. And between 1647 and 1724, imperial treatment of Catholic missions often changed between good and bad, and local officials often took matters into their own hands. The governor of Fujian, where the Dominicans were, was decidedly anti-Christian. And in 1709, he circulated a request to abolish Christianity from the entire empire. And another official initiated a fierce anti-missionary movement in 1723. He ordered the Dominican churches to be either destroyed or converted into non-Christian buildings. used as schools, warehouses, or temples for popular Chinese deities. Chinese Catholics were ordered to apostatize, and the Dominican priests were commanded to leave China. St. Capias was born on August 14, 1607, and in 1623 he entered the Dominican order. Even before he was sent to China, young Francis was known for his exceptional piety and his desire to serve others as Christ had commanded. When he was a new friar in Spain, he made daily visits to the sick and dying after praying with his brothers. And when Francis heard news about the Christian missionaries being martyred in the Far East, Francis asked to go to Asia and replace those who had died. He finally arrived at China in 1642 after a punishing sea voyage, following the example of St. Dominic, who made a habit of genuflecting several times in front of the figure of the crucified Christ. Francis Capias knelt for hours in prayer, causing severe pain in his knees. His church at Fuan was plundered twice in 1647, and the Dominicans were falsely accused of collaborating with rebels. Severe persecutions began, and Capias was forced to hide to avoid capture. On November 13, 1647, he was called to administer last rites to a dying Catholic, and he risked his life to go to the suffering man. He was discovered on the way. A rope was tied around his neck, and he was taken to an official tribunal for trial. St. Capias endured several long interrogations, during which he was cruelly tortured. His ankles were crushed. He was flogged by a whip. And while he was in prison, he was starved and exposed to freezing temperatures. On January 15, 1648, an exhausted Capias was flogged again and dragged to the execution ground and beheaded while he recited the rosary. His body was unceremoniously thrown outside the city walls to be ravaged by the elements and wild dogs. In the Vatican's extensive records of St. Capias' death, there are several testimonies by local Chinese who recall that when Christians searched for his body 2 months later, they found that all the bodies but his had decayed and were mostly eaten by animals. They stated that one dead woman's arm had fallen onto Capias' chest and was the only part of her body that remained undecayed. I should say here that the Dominicans adopted a very different approach than did their Jesuit brothers in China. The Dominicans relied more on the visible cross and public preaching than on the more scholarly methods employed by the Jesuits. It was among the poor rather than the educated elite that the Dominicans felt more comfortable. And so China's intellectuals turned against them. A century after Capias was beheaded, Rome selected 2 devout friars to be made bishops in China, Peter Sanz and Francis Serrano. Serrano unfortunately died before receiving his bishop's cross. Local officials were quite displeased with the more public methods of preaching used by the Spanish Dominicans, and Sanz and Serrano were very visible targets for their anger. Peter Sanz is a powerful example of how uncertain missionary life was in the 17th century in China. Sanz spent over 32 restless years hiding in people's homes and escaping Chinese authorities before he was finally captured and heartlessly beheaded. He was born in Spain on September 2nd, 1680. His twin sister died during childbirth. Peter at last joined the Dominican order in 1697 and began to prepare for the priesthood. He selected Peter, Martyr of Verona, as his patron, who, according to tradition, was killed on his way to Milan by a heretic. Peter of Verona was struck on his head by a sharp blade, and while dying, he wrote the creed with his own blood on the ground. One of Sanz's early assignments was to direct the local confraternity of the Holy Rosary in Saragossa. and he witnessed the powerful effect the rosary had on the spiritual lives of those who recited it. Thus, for the remainder of his life, he organized confraternities of the Holy Rosary to foster piety. We might say that China's current devotion to the Rosary is in large part due to Sance's efforts. In 1712, he and 42 other Dominicans set sail for the East. Among his confreres was the zealous seminarian Joachim Royo, who became Sance's close companion and later died with him in China. They lived in Manila while traveling to China's mainland in 1715. Sanz and Royo were little prepared for the intensity of living in China, but they were armed with the gospel, which they carried in their hands, and the rosary of Our Lady, which they wore at their waist where other men kept their swords. Joachim Royo was born on October 3rd, 1691, and was the youngest friar on the boat that left Spain for Asia in 1712. He received the Dominican habit in Valencia in 1709, and by 1712 he was on board a ship for China, where he first met Sanz, his teacher and spiritual advisor. Once Sanz and Royo were in China, they lived hunted lives. They knew little peace, since Christian missionaries were forbidden in China at that time. So in order to avoid being discovered together, the two men split up. Sanz went to Fu'an, where Capias had lived before his martyrdom. Once there, he quickly established a confraternity of the Holy Rosary and organized a group of Third Order Dominicans. Attached to the Third Order Dominicans was a special group of women who took a vow of celibacy and functioned as catechists, teaching the faith to other women. Both of these groups rapidly grew into an army of assistants that helped the small number of priests bring the gospel to more remote areas. Peter Sanz and his fellow Dominicans were forced to hide in the homes of the faithful to avoid arrest. And for a while, he lived in a narrow space in a convert's house, remaining in this cramped condition during the day, and only leaving in the darkness of night to offer Mass and hear confessions. In 1730, he heard from the Pope that he was to be made a bishop, and he secretly made his way to Guangdong, where he was ordained under very constrained conditions. It is really very astonishing that despite the constant threat of arrest and rough treatment, additional Dominicans were smuggled into China. They had to be disguised as fishermen or peasants. Among these new recruits were Francis Serrano and John Alcober. The newly consecrated Bishop Sanz was naturally pleased to have more priests to serve his growing flock. With these new Dominicans working in the vineyard, 500 new Christians were baptized in 1738, and Bishop Sanz was able to confirm 4,000 new Catholics in 1740. While Sanz, Royo, Alcober, and Serrano were building the Catholic community in Fujian, local officials continued to hold investigations to discover who attended masses, and they encouraged Chinese converts to apostatize. Anti-Christian persecution in Fujian grew more extreme, and Father Royo was forced to hide in graves, secret rooms, and cemeteries, going out only at night to administer the sacraments. The Dominicans had to offer Mass secretly in the homes of native Catholics. All of the churches had been confiscated by the local officials. At last, Father Royo was discovered on July 3rd, 1756, hiding between two cramped walls in the home of a devout Chinese Christian. The government soldiers completely demolished the poor man's home, and Royo was bound around his neck with a rope and arrested as a common prisoner. Royo's capture happened only a few days after 66-year-old Bishop Peter Sanz had turned himself in to the Chinese authorities. Sanz was weak with hunger and physical ailments after years of hiding in small places. Royo was bound in chains and forced to walk to Fu'an. where he was presented to the magistrate for a series of beatings and humiliating trials. Not only were the priests arrested and tortured, but several Chinese Catholics were also taken to the cold and damp prison at Fuzhou. Heavy chains were clasped around their necks and hands as they walked, and open wounds soaked their clothes with blood. John Alcover and Francis Serrano had traveled together on the same boat from Spain to the Philippines and then to China, where they lived hunted lives like Sanz and Royo. Alcover was born on December 21st, 1694, and entered the Dominican order in 1708. He was known for his tremendous holiness and dedicated prayer life. In 1728, he and Serrano were sent to China through Macau, and by the time they arrived at the Dominican mission at Fuan, the churches were already taken and destroyed by anti-Christian officials. And only after a year in China, Alcover wrote a very moving letter to his superior, describing the desperation of their situation in China. He wrote, "Dearest Provincial Superior, all of our churches have been confiscated and emptied, and the rest have been demolished into ruins. Everyone in the village was non-Christian, so I didn't dare to leave my dwelling for fear of being captured and taken away. I've hidden like this for as long as 2 weeks at a time." They lived under constant terror of discovery. And on one occasion, Father Alcover was even moved to a new location in a small coffin. Alcover was found and arrested in the middle of the night. In a letter he wrote, "On June 26, 1747, between 11 and 12 o'clock at night, about 100 soldiers attacked my home. They took me and tied a leather whip around my neck very tightly. They then dragged me to the river near the town of Muyang. Alcover was imprisoned and interrogated for 4 months before his sentence to be executed was announced. His close companion, Francis Serrano, was born on December 4th, 1695, and he became a Dominican at the Priory of the Holy Cross in Granada when he was only 17 years old. When he later entered China with Alcover, the two men dressed like Chinese peasants to avoid discovery. They were determined to bring Christ to China no matter the dangers. They sometimes had to hide in pits that Christians had dug to keep them out of sight. But in June of 1746, the Dominican friars were finally discovered. They were placed in chains, and their faces were whipped with a leather strap as they were transported to the prison. Pope Benedict XIV appointed Serrano a bishop while he was in prison, but he was martyred before receiving his pectoral cross. In addition to Bishop Sanz and Fathers Alcover, Royo, and Serrano, one more Spanish Dominican was executed in October 1748, the holy priest Francis Diaz. He was born on October 2nd, 1713, and according to one source, when he was still a child, he told his father that he wanted to go to China to preach the gospel and be a martyr for Christ. He became a Dominican when he was 17, and by 1738, he was living in China. Father Royo wrote in a letter, "Father Diaz's health is poor, but it is because of his apostolic zeal. He hears confessions until late at night and gives Holy Communion, and maintains a recollected spirit, and has the greatest horror of the least sin of which he may be guilty. Nothing is too hard when the care of souls calls him, but pagans and Christians admire his simplicity and honesty." Diaz was perhaps the most passionate missionary of all the Dominicans in China, and his passion attracted the attention of the local government that was determined to rid China of all missionaries. Of all these Spanish friars, each of them deeply devoted to Our Lady and our Blessed Lord. They suffered frightful torments during their last days. Of the 5 Dominicans imprisoned together, Bishop Sanz was the first called to the Lord. In April of 1747, a decree was posted in public early in the morning. The announcement was brief. Emperor Qianlong had ordered the execution of the Reverend Fathers. So the exhausted priests practiced spiritual devotions to prepare for their imminent deaths. And once, while joined in prayer together, a spectacular miracle occurred. Both Catholic and non-Christian witnesses have provided testimonies regarding what happened. And the most stirring account was written by one of their fellow prisoners named Ye Chuan Dao. He wrote, quote, "On one day while Bishop Sanz, Father Serrano, and Father Royo were praying in the prison roof opened. Rays of light shot through, and a brilliant cloud slowly descended down onto their beds. Then it rose up and turned into a beam of light. I could see the sky. It was astonishing," end quote. And the non-Christian guards who later took Bishop Sanz to his execution reported seeing a strange phenomenon in the sky at that same moment. Around 4 p.m. on Friday, May 26, 1747, 10 executioners summoned Bishop Sanz. One source says that while he was praying the rosary, the executioners entered his cell and took the shackles from his feet and cut off his hair in order to make it easier to cut off his head. Serrano heard Bishop Sanz's final confession, and Sanz was taken to the governor provincial, where he was forced to kneel while his chains were removed. Some of his flesh was torn from his body. He was accused of spreading false teachings and condemned to execution. They took him outside the city gate to the execution ground, and Sanz, just before the blade cut off his head, announced, "Now I will rise to heaven." A Chinese priest, Father Fu, collected some of the martyr's blood as a holy relic. One story recalls that a blind man's sight was restored after smearing the blood onto his eyes. The faces of the 4 remaining Dominicans were branded with a heated iron with the words "condemned to death," and on October 28, 1748, they were at last horribly executed. Father Serrano and Royo were killed by suffocation, and Alcober and Diaz were strangled to death. The 2 guards who were ordered to execute Serrano wrote an account of when they killed him. Father Serrano, they said, saw the 2 of us enter his room in the black of night, and he knew straight away what we were up to. He encouraged us to convert, and after he spoke, he knelt down and recited his prayers. We walked over to him and restrained his head. Then we took 6 pieces of torn cloth with egg paste soaked in them with water. They hardened and obstructed his mouth and nose. When completely thickened, they caused him to suffocate, and then we trampled him. His air was cut off, and he died. This horrible method of execution causes the victim to suffer a long agony before finally dying. Royo was suffocated in the same way. Alcober and Diaz were also awakened in the middle of the night. The guards who executed them wrote that the 2 priests were already praying on their knees when they arrived. The guards tied hempen cords around their necks and twisted each cord 3 times, prolonging their deaths over several minutes. Serrano, Royo, Alcober, and Diaz all suffered their martyrdoms that same evening, and news very quickly reached the local Christians, who gathered the remains of their bodies. Their executions were naturally lamented, but the Dominican order has a very clear understanding of death. St. Dominic had told his followers at his deathbed not to mourn. For as he told them, "Do not weep, beloved ones, do not sorrow that this frail body goes. I am going to where I can serve you better. For once one is in heaven, his prayers more powerfully rise to God on behalf of those left behind." The Dominican saints, Saints Capillas, Sanz, Royo, Alcober, Serrano, and Diaz, have become great intercessors on behalf of the Church in China, and their deaths remain a holy witness to Christ and a holy witness to the glory of Christ's Church. They were, as the Dominicans describe themselves, holy preachers of God.